Hey everyone, it's Ed Gutowski. What I wanted to do was I wanted to add to our understanding of rhetoric and argument. I've started grading some of the discussion board questions. They're fantastic. We talked about, I'm still going to define rhetoric as words used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. But I've noticed as I go through the discussion board questions that a lot of students like to use the term to persuade as part of their definition of rhetoric. And I think what we're going to do in the course of the next couple of weeks, we'll put that definition to the test. But the discussion boards questions have been great, and we've added a little bit of our understanding of how rhetoric and argument works, because we know that rhetoric and argument uses three things, right? We know rhetoric and argument uses logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos is an appeal to logic. And that would make sense if we wanted to suggest that logos is the ability to persuade. Pathos is an appeal to emotion, which would make sense if we wanted to accept my definition as words used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And then we know there's ethos, and ethos is character and authority. So now what I want to do is I want to understand, kind of add to our understanding of rhetoric and argument, to talk about something. This is how rhetoric and argument separates itself, because there's something that rhetoric always uses that a good argument will avoid, and that is fallacies. So rhetoric will separate itself from an argument by fallacies. Right? There's one definition of rhetoric, which is the deliberate use of fallacies. So we kind of have two things I want to do in this lecture. First, I kind of want to just define what the term fallacies means, and then I want to help you kind of identify some fallacies by using this textbook. And I recognize that some of you may have the newer edition, but I'm using the older edition. And so if I was in a ground class, what I would do is I would write down the term fallacies on the board, and I'd ask students, what do they think the term fallacy means? Some students may be familiar with the term, some students may have no idea. But if you just listen to the word fallacy, or you hear or you see the word fallacy, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And so oftentimes students hear the word fallacy and they hear something fake, right? Fallacies is something fake or something that's false. I will define fallacies as false logic. And if you want to think about it, this is why I think it's important for students to be able to recognize how fallacies work. Because let's say that you go out in the real world and you come across someone using rhetoric, and you accept my definition of rhetoric as words used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And then what if you catch that person using a fallacy, meaning they're saying something that's fake or something that's false? What happens is your brain starts to critical think, and rhetoric's less likely to have an impact on you. So I think it's important to just be able to identify fallacies in the real world. And my definition of a fallacy, it's very simplistic. I define it as false logic. But you'll notice that in some cases, there are fallacies that are listed under logos, fallacies listed under pathos, and fallacies listed under ethos. So, there may be some people who disagree with my definition of fallacies. But in our St. Martin's Handbook, if you turn to page, and again, this is on this edition, but it's on page 150. And if you look at from pages 150, 151 to 152, there are a list of fallacies in our textbook. And there are something like 17 different fallacies. And I think it's kind of important for students to kind of play around with fallacies to be able to identify them. So there are two fallacies that I like a lot, right? And the first fallacy I like is the ad hominem. And the ad hominem is on page 150. And what an ad hominem is when you attack a person's character rather than addressing the issue. When you attack a person's character rather than dealing with the issue. So let's imagine that there is a student in our class who just absolutely hates our class. Hates the online class, he's mad, and he drops our class and runs over to the library and says, hey, whatever you do, don't take Professor Gutowski's class. He's a son of a bitch. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class, he's just like Hitler. Don't take Professor Gutowski, he's just like Saddam Hussein. Well, notice what that student did was used a fallacy, right? He attacked my character rather than addressing the issue, right? He even went so far as to call me a son of a bitch, tried to compare me to Hitler or Saddam Hussein, right? Notice that person didn't address an issue. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class. His online class is confusing. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class. He doesn't give you enough time to complete assignments. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class. He uses textbooks like Into the Wild that students have already read. Rather than addressing an issue, he attacks my character. The other fallacy that I really like is I like the non sequitur. And the non sequitur, I'm going to look over here, is probably on, I don't know what page it's on, but the non sequitur is when you join two things that have nothing in common and you try to associate them together. So you have two things that have nothing in common and you try to associate them together. So notice that same student who said, hey, don't take Professor Gutowski's class, he's just like Hitler. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class, he's just like Saddam Hussein. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class, it's just like Auschwitz. Notice what that student did was he associated two things that have nothing in common. Because no matter what you think of my class, it's nothing like a concentration camp, right? So I like the non sequitur. It's when you associate two things that have nothing in common. The reason that I think I like these two fallacies is because I see them all the time in the real world, right? We have a former president, a president who's running for re-election, who actually uses these fallacies all the time, right? Donald Trump loves to use the ad hominem, right? So I think these two fallacies, and then I think there's, another fallacy I like is the bandwagon. The bandwagon, just as it sounds, right? Everyone else is doing it, why aren't you? Right? Everyone else is taking Professor Gutowski's class, why aren't you? Everyone else is smoking pot, why aren't you? Right? So I like those three fallacies. So what I'm going to have you do for your discussion board is kind of respond to this discussion and then look over the fallacies on page 150, 151, 152, and then just tell me of the 17 fallacies, which fallacy do you like the best? And then from there we can kind of add to our understanding of rhetoric.